You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas once again. And I got my friend back on the show. I hinted at who this could be last week, and some of you guys left some comments. Some of you knew who it was. My old friend, Jeff Deist, formerly the president of the Mises Institute. Now he's over at Monetary Metals. He worked for the great Ron Paul at one point. He's got a very cool new book out. I say new-ish at this point, called A Strange Liberty. Politics Drops Its Pretenses. And one of the things I got to, well, for one, Jeff's perspectives are always thought-provoking to me, and I love discussing things with him and getting his take on current events, recent events, we could say, not necessarily even super current, but we've talked on this show about how we don't really have a civilization anymore. And one of the things that will kill a high-functioning civilization is a very high time preference society. And that is what we have now. And unlike when I screwed up, when I had Jason from the 2-Bit podcast on and I said the exact opposite definitions, high time preference means right here, right now, you don't think of the future. That is what we have. That's a very tribal mindset. And a civilized mindset being low time preference, where you sacrifice currently for the future. And so once that low time preference mindset goes away, your civilization starts to collapse. And that's kind of what we're in the midst of right now. So we talk about that. And an interesting perspective on this is, what does the Federal Reserve have to do with, let's say, influencing the time preference of a society? Is that possible? We get into that. We get into all sorts of things. And like I said, I love having Jeff on. I think you guys are going to find this conversation thought-provoking. And let's bring him back in right now. Welcome back to the show. It's been way too long. My friend, Jeff Deist. How are you, sir?
Buck Johnson, good to see you, man.
Good to see you, too. It's been way too long. I have a lot of new listeners, I suppose, since the last time you were on that may be in our orbits, maybe some aren't. So I'll let you give a quick intro of who you are, what you do, and then we'll jump in from there.
Well, currently, I am the general counsel for a company called Monetary Metals. We're involved in gold bonds and leases and silver bonds and leases in various parts of the world. So it's a pretty interesting industry. Putting gold to work is the way we view it. And of course, prior to that, I worked for a time at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, where I worked for a time with Dr. Ron Paul in Washington, D.C. And before that, I was doing deal work as a lawyer.
Well, one of the things I wanted you on here for, I've known you for several years, and you always have a kind of a unique, nuanced, well thought out, many words I could use, perspective on some things. And it feels like since I used to see you and talk to you at Mises Institute events, like 2012, 13, 14, 15, that a lot has changed politically, culturally, everywhere. Yes. I guess I want to start with, what major shifts have you seen in culture, society? I mean, we can do economics, but in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. Economics is faded, I think. I mean, maybe the biggest shift is that Buck Johnson became an Orthodox Christian. So
that's a big one.
We should start there, because that sort of tempers my entire relationship with you and my view of you. Not a bad way, but I would say it definitely tempers it. And economics, I think, has lost its way in those 10 years to bigger cultural, societal, populist concerns. And so I think the profession of economics, which used to animate so much of my thinking and so much of my time, has shrunk. I mean, what are these economists doing? They're not much, from what I can tell. They're supposed to be social scientists, which means they're supposed to be helping us understand the human world of human interactions around us and explain it. And they've retreated, as they always do, into their statistics and their charts and their graphs and their bullshit GDP and CPI and unemployment. And in the meantime, there's a real spiritual cultural malaise, not just in America, but across the West, that certainly is bound up with and involves economics, but economics is only a part of it. And so because they don't want to touch anything outside of their narrow lane, graphs and charts, I fear that the economics profession has become sort of a sideshow, just a jobs program for professional economists.
Mm-hmm. There's I know this term's all the rage right now about the competency crisis. I started noticing it particularly after 2020, as you would return to restaurants just on low level things like that. And it's like, what's going on here? But I assume that, is it a competency crisis in the economics industry as well? It's just people that is it like ideology that's controlling them, or they're just not as wise as they used to be?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's certainly not an easy degree, even at the undergraduate level, or it shouldn't be. And I would say getting a PhD in economics is pretty tough stuff. If you go to most universities today, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but to get a PhD in economics, you have to do really hardcore math. You have to do high level 700, 800 level math, vector calculus and that sort of thing, which has nothing to do with economics, but c'est la vie. And as a result, a lot of the PhD economists in programs today in the US are foreign. A lot of them are Indian and Chinese, people who have drilled math really, even starting K through 8. And so they can perform these kind of advanced mathematics that are demanded of a PhD in econ today. So that's probably unfortunate. But, I think academia in general, we all know the troubles it presents. We all know the problems it's undergoing. And I suppose that the economics profession reflects that more broadly. There are people who are still trying to sort of hold on to these sinecures, and there probably is a competency crisis. I would suspect that most young people don't know anything about economic history. They don't know much about Adam Smith or Marx or John Maynard Keynes or any of the things we would want them to understand the history of their own profession. That would be nice for starters. So that's not really taught much today. And as I said, it's very, very mathy. And God bless people who can do that kind of math. I don't think I could. But, the profession's in a little bit of a crisis. And I think as a result, it really cries out for the kind of theory which used to mark the economics profession, the theory that the Austrian school provides in particular. Economists used to write treatises. They used to be cross-disciplinary. They used to talk to other fields and disciplines like philosophy, and they used to not be scared of their own shadow. It was a confident profession, I think, at one time. And now it's all about plumbing. It's all about these little technical details of what's going on with the latest numbers. And that's not doing mankind much good, in the sense that, like any discipline, economics is supposed to find the truth first and foremost, but that's in service of making us healthier, happier, wiser people, right? There ought to be some good to it. And at present, we do have a competency crisis, and it's not just, who's bolting together that Boeing 737 MAX that you're flying on next week. Academics can only do so much harm within the university setting. The guy who's putting together your 737 MAX, if he had a binge over the weekend, you might be in trouble.
Mm-hmm. I think to have a stable society, maybe some would call it a good civilization, a healthy civilization, you need a competent elite and a culture of what we would say low time preference. And it seems like we have neither of those. So what are your thoughts on the elite that we do have right now? And then expanding from that, the I would say high time preference society that seems to be kind of pushed on purpose.
Oh, there's no question. We're encouraged to be high time preference individuals in all kinds of ways, not just in, let's say, our how we spend money, but how we spend time. Whether we go for the instant gratification of some sort of mind-numbing entertainment consumption, or some sort of cheap, fulfilling calories in the form of something some sort of food we shouldn't be eating, high time preference in our approach to dating or family or sex and sexuality. It's sort of a weird postmodern throwback to the 60s. So I think that's very true. I will say Michael Malice has a general saying or a dictum, which is basically oligarchs are inevitable, elite rule is inevitable. And I think that's true. If you look at the Pareto optimal rule in any society, you're going to have sort of a 90-10 distribution or maybe a 95-5 distribution. So it's not a matter of creating a society without elites, which is a horrific pipe dream, which generally leads to lots of people getting butchered. We've seen that certainly in the 20th century, but it's more about who the elites are and do they hate your guts. In other words, Hoppe has pointed out that in a monarchical society, the elite has at least some interest in maintaining what we might call the capital or intellectual stock of the nation, as opposed to depleting it. Whereas in a high time preference system, which is encouraged by democratic voting, of course, politicians who are part of the elite have a very strong incentive to spend money now and incur debt now and debase currency now to get goodies so that voters will vote for them now. And then when the bill comes due, they're long gone. They're no longer in office or they're dead or whatever it might be. And we can see this in something as obvious as Social Security, which was passed in the 1930s by people who were long dead. It was promised at the time as simply a way to keep little old ladies, but mostly widows at the time, from being thrown out in the streets. Who could object to that? There were something like 40 workers paying into the system for every one beneficiary. And the life expectancy was below 65. So the time when Social Security started to pay was generally, you would only pay for a few years because people didn't live to be 90 or 95 in the way they do today. So you fast forward not quite 100 years, 90 years, and you see that we've got a serious crisis in Social Security. And it's not just a financial crisis in the sense that there's going to be more baby boomers living a lot longer and making demands on Social Security Medicare, but it's also a moral and ethical crisis. There are the questions of young people subsidizing the old. And, you drive around Austin, Texas, and there's a lot of ordinary oldsters who are worth $2, $3, $4 million, right? In their 401k and their pension and their house and this sort of thing. So why should a 25-year-old recent Hispanic immigrant who's working an hourly job at a hotel be required to have 7% of his or her paycheck go out to that elderly person? I mean, I think that's a moral and ethical question. But also, how does that baby boomer live their life? I mean, how many decisions were affected throughout their lifetime by that thinking, that mentality, hey, I'm going to have that $2,000 a month or $3,000 a month, whatever, from Social Security. Did they take fancier vacations than they otherwise would have? Did they drive fancier cars? These are really interesting questions, and they're not just economic questions; they're social, cultural questions. And it's really hard to show. It's really hard to demonstrate how people behave differently, let's say, based on Social Security. But they do. They do behave differently. And we go back to what I consider the failure of most economists today is to show us, to give us a sense of what we call the unseen. Bastiat talking about this. It's like that unseen change in behavior among seniors because they get that $3,000 a month off the backs of young working people. I mean, how does that filter throughout a society? I would argue it does in profound ways, but it's very hard to see and it's very hard to quantify.
And speaking of boomers, you and I are both of the Generation X generation, and as Texas Monthly labeled me, a tattooed Generation X firefighter, like it was a bad thing. But the stranglehold on power, certainly throughout your lifetime and my lifetime, that boomers have had at the top, seems to be unnatural, way too long. I have a theory that it's so goofy and so much of a clown world now because it's outlived its usefulness, and so it's just idiocy. Do you see that slow, long stranglehold on power starting to crumble for the boomers? And do you also see a Generation X class of elites maybe ready to fill this void that could be coming? Or what are your thoughts there on the generational gap coming?
Well, it's tough because, we're making very gross generalizations about generations. But I'm older than you, but I guess we're both Gen X. The Gen X is much smaller than the baby boomer generation as a segment of the population. It's also much smaller than the millennials, which follows up. So I think our time in the sun is going to be brief. And that competency crisis you spoke of, I mean, let's give the boomers some credit. In a sense, it's that boomer you do want going right now.
Yes,
as opposed to maybe the 30-year-old tweaker. And I bring up this drug thing because I recently saw a whistleblower segment about, some of the conditions at Boeing plants that people were talking about, off the record. And so there is something to be considered about this transfer of power from boomers. But in housing, it's an absolute abomination. We just haven't built enough houses, and these boomers all have these gigantic McMansions, which I guess they think they're going to sell someday to people with 0 or 1 kid. And they definitely still control law firms, accounting firms, the academia. They're all holding way too long in academia. The Walter Blocks of the world, 82 years old. They're definitely holding on far too long in all kinds of industries where we could probably use some freshening up. But I mean, that's neither here nor there. The question is really, are we going to be able to support them as they live a lot longer and consume a lot more healthcare towards the end of their lives? I mean, that's a tough question. And, the multiculturalists don't want to address this, but in tiny Sweden, tiny Norway of 1970, you have a culturally and ethnically, not to be too fine about it, a culturally and ethnically homogenous country. So when you have a socialist welfare state, you're sort of literally supporting old people like we do here. That old person was almost grandma, right?
Yes.
6 degrees of separation, Kevin Bacon. It's probably fewer degrees than that in a place like Norway or Sweden. So, but when you get a big multiracial, multicultural democracy of 330 million people, like the present day U.S., that creates low trust. People say, well, why am I paying Social Security? I'm for this old white lady somewhere, I'm a Mexican immigrant, right? I mean, that's a fair question, frankly. And so we haven't thought this through very well. The social democracy model, which our neoliberal friends have perfected, and I would include most libertarians amongst that, is going to face some real challenges. If you look at France, if you look at Germany, if you look at the UK, they're further along. If you look at Canada, I would say they're further along in the social democracy model than the United States. But nonetheless, we're on the same track and the same path. And, we're going to find out. And I think entitlements are a big part of that. There's a guy named Lawrence Kotlikoff at Princeton, an economist, who basically figured out what kind of entitlement promises we've made in the future in terms of Social Security and Medicare, and what the likely tax receipts are in that same future, call it 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. And there's a huge gap, many, many, many trillions of dollars between what Uncle Sam is likely to take in taxes and what he's likely to have to pay out in Social Security and Medicare. And that's very, very frightening. I don't want to put that off on young people. I mean, if you could say, I'm in my 50s, if you could say to a Gen Xer like me, hey, you got to give up all your Social Security. You paid into it the last 30 years. Too bad. You didn't have to go to Vietnam. You didn't have to go to World War II. So your price is you got to give that up because it's unsustainable. Yeah, I guess I wouldn't be happy about that, but I could accept that. But we're not going to do that. There's no political will for actually wrestling these kind of questions to the ground. And I think that's symptomatic of America in general. This is a huge crisis. We have no political will to do anything. Look at what Congress does all day. They're talking about Israel or Ukraine or post offices or TikTok. They're not talking about the deep structural problems with U.S. debt, deficits with the dollar, with entitlements. I mean, these kind of, they can't wrestle these bears to the ground. So instead, they occupy themselves with trivialities.
Yes, and I think part of that's the low time preference versus high time preference thing. Because even some boomer cons, the thing on October 7th happened. Supposedly Israel had no idea that was going to happen. Let's pretend they didn't. But they're like, well, we got to go defend them. It's like, we can't. You've wasted trillions of dollars on other stuff just because you're emotionally upset for a second. Like, no, not that, we're not doing that. And so there's this, even with like older Republicans, that's like, well, I'm pissed off. Let's go fight. It's like, we don't have any money, man. What are you talking about? And you're soaking a lot of it up because of, so not you personally, but that generation, it's bizarre. And it's like, it's just very high time preference. I saw something that made me mad. We got to act right now rather than thinking things out.
And maybe the ultimate time preference is boomers saying, I don't care what happens as long as I get my Social Security, right?
Yes.
In other words, as long as the day I drop off this birth, Social Security ends, that's not the way most generations have been, to put it mildly.
Right.
There is one thing that is radically different about baby boomers, in that they are the first generation in history to have basically, shrugged off the cultural inheritance of their ancestors. The first generation in history to say, no, we don't care about monogamy. We don't care about families. We have birth control. We don't care about God. We don't care about any of these things which have basically governed, personal conduct. Apart from government and law, internal mechanism. We're just going to throw all that to the wind. And I think we're reaping a lot of that, divorce, hedonism, and that's, I think a lot of the fruits of the 1960s are now coming to bear fruit. And part of that is the parenting, which was passed to millennials, right? This sort of failure to launch generation that's not necessarily ready for the rough and tumble of the work world, or the fact that sometimes bad things happen in life, and the fact that you're not special.
Yes.
I think a lot of that can be laid at the feet of their boomer parents.
Speaking of millennials,
I'm sure, not to digress, but I'm sure you see this firefighter world.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yes. And we have, maybe it sounds prideful, but I do think within my fire department, if the millennials make it up and through all of the process that it takes to be hired, they are kind of the best of the best, in my opinion. And even then, some of them, I'm like, holy goodness, you're not special. Have you never had anything tough? They get to the fire academy, which I've been in charge of a few times. And on the first 2 weeks, they're like, oh, I'm out. It's like, well, what'd you think this was going to be? So it's kind of shocking. And that's with the fire academy being much less strict than it was when I came through. Not to sound like the old guy, but I can promise you, when it was black pavement and 110 in the summer, we didn't have gloves on while we're doing push-ups. I would spit on my hand to cool them down. Now they have gloves, but just little things like that. Mm-hmm. And speaking of millennials, you're good at this. You're walking me right into what I was going to ask you about. Famously, and this is something, until I started meeting more millennials, I didn't honestly think too heavily about, but it does seem that compared to previous generations, certainly mine and my parents, they don't own much. Specifically in the housing world, I've started, a lot of them, and they're all good, some of the ones I'm friends with, but they just rent. And so there's this argument now, well, buying stuff's a waste anyway. I do think, and you're very well tuned in on this, it's partially or maybe largely because of the behemoth that is the Federal Reserve. But can you talk about this millennial generation, their lack of being able to actually afford to buy a house, and why that maybe has happened?
Well, we should have built millions more houses in this country than we have in the past 50 years. That's for starters. And so that can't all be laid at the Fed. I mean, a lot of that is zoning, regulations, NIMBYism, anti-growth mentalities. And a lot of that is also boomers pulling up the ladder, right? There's a lot of federal policies which favor housing, which benefit real estate developers and, lower interest rates for many, many decades, really 1982 till 2022. we really had 40 straight years of lowering interest rates, which of course encourages house ownership. People buy houses. And I do think that millennials and Zoomers below them have a valid argument that they got screwed in the housing game. I think that's absolutely true. We haven't built enough, and the regulatory structure is such that we can't really build the kind of cheap starter homes that may be $100,000, right? If you're a young person and you make $30,000 a year, $100,000 home would be, within reason as a percentage of your income, and 20% down, this sort of thing. But if you make $30,000 or $40,000, $400,000 house, it's just crazy. It just doesn't make any sense. And Austin is ground zero for all this.
Yep.
It's a cautionary tale. And Austin, unlike a lot of places, is big, and Austin can grow out. A lot of places can't. Seattle can't because of the water. Manhattan can't. Chicago has some limits. So it's like if you live in one of those cities, you can see how the ability of younger people to save money up, doesn't work because prices are rising faster than they can save. And then on top of that, now you're in a 7-8% interest rate environment from a mortgage, then you're in a whole different ballgame. The same house that cost $2,000 a month back at sub 3% is now same house $4,000 a month.
Yep.
And all of a sudden that gets pretty crazy. And let's not forget that the alternative, which is renting, landlords have taken advantage of this rising interest rate environment. It's not like we brought a ton of new apartments online either. So they have been able to raise rents precipitously because it's so difficult for young people to go out to buy. So they're getting sort of a whipsaw effect. It's hard to buy, but renting isn't easy either. So I do think that they've gotten the short end of the stick on housing. And that's sad because, there's, again, the time preference issue. There's some cultural and social things which flow from that. If you're not going to have a house, then that changes your whole attitude. Maybe I should just, go have fun on the weekends and go on trips, because what's the point of trying to save up a down payment? Maybe I should lease a fancy car. God, the average, the number of people in America now with $1,000 car payment is just staggering.
Yes.
It's just staggering. If there's anything I can impart to you at any age, including my age, is buy used cars for cash. My God. But beyond that, if houses were more affordable, and maybe I'd be more marriage-minded, maybe I'd be more children-minded, but all these things sort of just get washed away. And so we have this sort of perpetual adolescence of, apartment living and sort of fun and brunch and drinking and this sort of thing, which is all fine, but that used to sort of burn out and then you moved on. But
right.
So again, economists ought to be showing us this. They ought to be demonstrating how the X, Y, and Z economic policy, zoning, regulation, housing, Federal Reserve, flows into this. And that's a very, the moral and cultural degradation caused by, let's say, central bank policy is really a fascinating and I think uncovered topic. Some people like Professor Guido Halsman have touched on it, but we tend to be so value neutral in our worldview that the idea of ever judging anyone it's just beyond these academics.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because a priest friend of mine said in regards to the Zionists and stuff pushing war for Israel, bad theology can lead to bad, deadly results. And it's kind of similar here. Bad economic policy or bad, a lack of good economic education can essentially lead to like a spirit of nihilism amongst young people. It's like, who cares? I can't afford anything. I'll just blow my money or it can go on OnlyFans.
Yeah.
Who really cares?
Yeah, well, if we had a culture that rewarded saving, then, all those little monthly subscriptions to various streaming, those $6 coffees instead of the instant coffee you make at home. Then you can look at all that stuff and realistically say, hey, a few extra $100 a month is meaningful, and this ability to save, this idea of capital accumulation, which goes to a low type preference, someone who prefers to sacrifice now and have a better life in the future. That, in saving money, for example. That's so interesting. And I really think, it's a great measure of society. We brought up elites earlier. I think, whether elites have any feeling for and concern and compassion for average people, or whether they hate their guts, which is the present scenario in the West, I think that's an important measure of society, But another important measure, I think, is the ability of average people to save money above the rate of inflation. In other words, my grandparents were not financially sophisticated. They were ordinary people. They had one job. My grandfather, grandma stayed at home, and yet I'm not saying it was easy, but I'm saying it was simple. It was just thrift, just spend less than you make. And then they could take the difference and they could put it in very safe, easy, understandable savings vehicles at the local bank, in a certificate of deposit, maybe in a treasury. They weren't required to go out and figure out how to buy Bitcoin or FANG stocks or Tesla or NVIDIA or whatever it is. They weren't required to go out and chase yield. They were just people who saved money. And so if we take that away from people, if we make the real rate of inflation higher than simple savings vehicles, then we've really profoundly altered the whole structure of society. And everything we have around us is not just an economic, but it's a cultural request, right? I mean, when you go driving around Austin, everywhere you go, there's buildings and Starbucks and all this stuff. That is because many, many, many future generations, slowly but surely, spent less than they made collectively as a society. And so each generation left a little more. And that means roads and infrastructure and energy and food and all these things, hot and cold running water that we have at our fingertips. And now this incredible electronic infrastructure for digital communications. I mean, it's just staggering, the cultural bequest which we have inherited. And so if you turn that on its head, if you make it so that accumulation in every sense is actually punished, which inflation does directly, then you've done something that has never been done in the history of the world, which is you have changed the national incentive to save for a rainy day and put something away for your children. And again, that's broader than just economic, right? I mean, there's all the knowledge, all the wisdom that's been passed out to us, the medical treatments, the philosophy, the mathematics, the engineering, all this incredible knowledge, which is not a direct, economic thing, but it's between our ears. It's in our sphere of knowledge because previous generations sacrificed. And when you take that away, when saving is chumps, then I don't know where that leads. It doesn't lead any place good.
How did libertarianism as a philosophy, maybe broadly speaking, let's say, fare through 2020, 2021, and 2022?
Oh, fuck. So you're bringing up my least favorite subject on earth. And libertarianism has lost its way, to put it mildly.
Okay.
Look, this idea, libertarian is an adjective. It's not a noun. There's no such thing as being libertarian. I'm a libertarian. Libertarian is an adjective to describe, let's say, a particular policy. Libertarian drug policy. So that's one of the ways that, what should be a simple worldview or mindset with respect to the legal structure of society turned into a whole thing, and not a good thing, in my opinion, because basically we, meaning those of us who are largely anti-state, we've allowed this to become an ideology. And it's not an ideology. Ideology is a cancer. This is the opposite of an ideology. The idea that you leave people alone and see what they do. That's not ideological. Markets are not ideologies. They're things that just coalesce naturally and bring us all the things we have. And so I don't like the idea of property and basic human liberty being viewed as some sort of political program or ideology, because I don't think that's what it is. obviously, I think the core concepts were necessary. There's ripe fruit and there's rotten fruit from the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and libertarians don't want to acknowledge this. They want to view the Enlightenment as an unalloyed good. Well, it was mostly good. But there are real problems today in society, which I think flow from anomie and the disruption of families and disruption of a natural order of elites and disruption of self for God. There's all kinds of ways we can look at that. So fast forward to 2020, fast forward to COVID. My God. The idea that walking around exhaling is a form of aggression. Thanks a lot, Walter Block. I mean, it's like terrible. I mean, these just incredibly bad places like the Cato Institute. I mean, what a scam. Just horrible. And of course, now they're pushing open borders.
Yes.
And these are things that I think are just very anti-human. And we should expect that when the idea of human liberty becomes divorced from responsibility, when it becomes divorced from the very social mechanisms that make it possible, right? In other words, we don't want any external governance. Well, there has to be internal governance. And where does that come from? It comes from social mores. It comes from family. It comes from religion, if one is a believer. It comes from philosophy. I mean, I know atheist subjectivists who are exceedingly principled in their personal lives based on a worldview that doesn't happen to involve spiritual, a deity or something. So I'm not someone, who thinks that there can't be a secular morality. I think there can be, but bastardizing the Enlightenment into some sort of hyper-rationalist individualist creed where anything goes as long as you're not hurting anyone. The idea that consent is the linchpin for a decent society. No, it isn't. I mean, it's like if I lay around on the couch all day watching golf and eating Doritos, which I would love to do, by the way, am I hurting anyone? I'm hurting myself. I'm hurting my family. I'm hurting, my parents. Or at least one of them's gone. Their memory of me. I mean, it's just a bad worldview. It doesn't comport with human nature. And if libertarianism doesn't comport with human nature, then it's in big, big trouble. So what we have today as libertarianism is basically total acceptance of all left cultural precepts.
Yes.
It's this idea of, it's like a liberation theology. Self-actualization is everything. Well, that's not everything. On the contrary. And so that's a strange liberty. That's why I call my book A Strange Liberty. As I think that's a very strange liberty. Liberty exists within a nexus of human relations. And Mises almost called human action social cooperation. Is our current society encouraging or discouraging social cooperation? I would say it's discouraging.
Right.
So what a lot of people think of as markets and liberty as these sort of economic or political abstractions, I think of them as just human beings acting, human nature, which ought to be left to its own devices for the most part. So I'm not. I don't know that libertarianism is much of a force today, especially after Trump, especially after Brexit, and where we've seen the left go, which is into some uncharted waters. The idea of libertarianism as we think of it, I think is pretty lost. And if insisting that there is something more to morality, to internal governance, makes me a right winger, then fine, I'm a right winger.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, I very much think of myself as being on the right.
Yes.
In the sense that I'm not an egalitarian and I believe in hierarchy. So, it's the left libertarians who were always saying, oh, I'm not not a left libertarian. I'm just a libertarian. Yeah, sure, buddy. Nobody's buying
Right.
that. And the other subterfuge which is used, the other obscuration is classical liberal. No, nobody's buying that. The left doesn't buy that. The left never says, "Oh, well, you're a classical liberal. Okay. We won't line you up against the wall." Just
Right.
those Trumpists.
Yes.
So there's a lot to be done, and I'm, personally, I can't judge anyone in your audience because, I find myself on the one hand completely apolitical, non-ideological, wanting no part of that whole world, and wanting to focus strictly on my own personal, family matters and such. But then another part of me says, that's never been less viable than it is today. In other words,
Right.
politics is interested in you.
Yes.
You're interested in God. And so, a lot of my thinking, even let's say 10 years ago, that the goal is a less political world, it sounds fanciful today.
Yep. You talked a lot about, over the years, soft secession, as opposed to at least maybe being easier to achieve than an actual, cut from the Union. I know you've been paying attention. Do you think what DeSantis was doing in Florida and now what Abbott's been doing in Texas a little bit is a step towards that soft secession?
Well, rhetorically, yes. I like some of the rhetoric because we have to get over this idea that the Supreme Court is somehow in charge of Texas and Florida. We have to get over this idea that the Biden administration is somehow in charge of Texas and Florida. It's not. So that's important. I think rhetorically, it's important to send a message, whether it's on the border issue or something else, to DC. So I like that. And I do think COVID provided us an unbelievable example of people voting with their feet.
Yes.
So that was very, very interesting because what people do is a lot more important than what they say.
Yep.
So I loved that. And, we are seeing a realignment. And there's some indications that, let's say, the people fleeing California and New Jersey and Illinois, which are three of the big donor states at this point, there's some indication that they are actually not bringing those same policies to their new states. And those states are generally Arizona, Texas, Florida, are three of the big donee states.
We became more Reddit.
Right.
Right.
And so what's so striking about that is there was on the left, there was an inevitability narrative about the Electoral College, which is that once Texas and Florida became purple and then blue, which they were inevitably and irrevocably going to do, then the GOP would be SOL forever and ever as a national party in national elections. And so that inevitability narrative was shaken quite a bit by both the election of Trump, which was deemed impossible. Hillary Clinton was the obvious first female president, and then COVID. So those two earthquakes really have shaken this idea of inevitability on the left, and so that's why the left reacts with such hysterical ferocity at these events, because they need to have a psychological coping mechanism to deal with and to accept what's happened. And that can't be that, people just somehow prefer Trump. Like, that's just not possible.
Right. Yeah.
For them psychologically, because here's Hillary Clinton and here's this crazy orange TV guy, who owns some casinos that declared bankruptcy. Right. So they just couldn't deal with that. So yeah.
It had to be Putin. It had to be Putin.
It had to be Putin. It had to be. Right. So, people are coalescing a little bit more along geographic lines, which I take as a positive thing. But it's, we're a long way from any kind of real challenge. I mean, the 9th and 10th Amendments, unfortunately, are mostly a dead letter, and most Americans have no conception of them, and most Americans have a very bastardized conception of the 14th Amendment. We've seen this come up recently with this idea of whether Trump can be viewed as an insurrectionist without an actual tribunal declaring him as such. But that's not the bad part of the 14th Amendment. The bad part is the so-called incorporation doctrine, which basically I totally reject. Judge Napolitano accepts it, by the way. to be fair, and he's a lot smarter than me. But I totally reject it, and it basically turned the states into glorified federal counties, and so there's a lot to be overcome there, and that would require some pretty brave and bold nullification at the state level to make that happen. But you know what? I mean, nobody thought Trump could happen. Nobody thought Brexit could happen. Nobody thought the former Soviet Union would fall. So things happen. They just happen slower than we like.
Right. Where do you? I hope you don't hate doing this part, but I always like asking guests, with especially who are dialed in like you are with a lot of things. What happens in November in your thought?
Oh boy. Well, I like this idea that there's no primaries because they don't want to soften up Joe Biden, but that at the 11th hour, due to his infirmities, shall we say, they bring in some sort of person like Gavin Newsom or Michelle Obama, and he announces that he's stepping down to deal with health matters or something like that, or even Kamala Harris. That's kind of a fun thing to think, just because we all, I guess that would be interesting to watch.
Right.
In the same way people slow down when they pass a car wreck, right?
Yeah, right.
But, that's probably not that. I would venture that the Biden or Trump is less popular than people think. The right, I think, especially the religious right, is forever overestimating its numbers. And I'm not so sure that Trump beats Joe Biden. But I don't know. I've been wrong before, but I'm pretty confident that whether it's through legal machinations by putting him in jail or declaring him unfit under that aforementioned 14th Amendment, I have a very hard time believing that regardless of the vote, that Trump enters office in January of 2025. I just don't think they would allow that. I think that's too damaging to the progressive psyche. And the rest of the world, of course, is on it as well. So if I'm going to predict a surprise, I'm going to predict that that if he wins, at least the Electoral College, that there's some other effort to deem him invalid to hold the office. I just, part of me just says there's no way they're going to let that guy, get back in office. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Trump already did what he was good for, which is kneecapping the Bush and Clinton crime families back in 2016. And so that was an important task. And libertarians, as usual, failed to see the upside in that. But that task is over, and he did a horrific job with COVID. And so I wish there were some alternative, but I don't. Right now, I don't really see one. I don't think I would be voting for Trump or Biden. That's for sure.
Okay. Well, and I'll get you out of here in just a second. My guest last week was DJ, our friend DJ Engel from Chronicles, and I did this at the end with him. It's just a word association game. So you tell me what the first few things you think of when you hear this person's name.
Okay.
Vivek Ramaswamy.
Illegitimately rich.
Kamala Harris.
Bobblehead.
Elon Musk.
An imperfect Caesar.
Tucker Carlson.
Maybe dead if he doesn't wash himself.
Pat Buchanan.
Just such a brilliant writer. I mean, his brevity. Fortunately, he's still with us, but he's not writing anymore, so he's retired.
And Ron Paul.
Friend.
Good. Now, in closing, what do you guys do over there, Monetary Metals, and pitch some of it? Because I know there's people listening, and also you can even tweak it with this. Are we in for something bad economically? We've been thinking possibly for a long time now but it's like this heroin keeps getting injected.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we are. I don't think we get out of this without some pain. And it's interesting. Bitcoin, silver, and gold have all been correlated in the last few weeks in terms of the rate of their rise. So that's unusual. Bitcoin and gold are generally not correlated. So you can take that for what it's worth, which is that those three signals tell us that, I don't view any of them as inflation hedges so much as I view them as bellwethers. People trying to get out of dollars at least somewhat. And all we care about is dollars versus the goods and services we want to buy. We don't care about dollars versus euro, dollar versus yuan, right? I mean, I think the guy named Brent Johnson and his dollar milkshake theory, you can look that up. I think he's correct. I think that, a global crisis actually strengthens the dollar. So relative to other currencies, I don't think the dollar is going to collapse anytime soon. I don't think gold's going to go to $5,000 anytime soon. I don't think we're going to go back to a gold standard. I don't think we are going to have a hyperinflationary or hyperdeflationary collapse. More likely, I think that gold, like it has for 5,000 years, will continue to retain some moneyness. So that's really what we do at Monetary Metals. We say, hey, there's $14 trillion worth of gold out there. As a matter of fact, most of the gold that's ever been mined and produced in human history is still with us because it doesn't melt. You can't destroy it in a fire. You can't destroy it with a flood. Take some of that $14 trillion and put it to use financing things. I mean, why aren't insurance companies using gold as collateral? Why aren't all kinds of businesses and manufacturing facilities using gold for lending? It's a very strange asset in that it just sits there physically. If you own billions of dollars worth of real estate, you are almost certainly collateralizing that real estate, right? You are almost certainly using it as a tool or at least collateral for financing. But nobody seems to be doing that with gold except for us. And that's the idea, is we're putting gold to work in lending and financing.
Excellent. There's this tech, I know you're familiar with the Texas Bullion Depository or something like that. Is that a good thing for people here?
Absolutely. That came to be under legislation from the Texas State House. So it's not purely private, but nonetheless, the idea that you could have at the state level a storehouse of gold, whatever it might be. You could even have a digital storehouse, something that was an electronic fortress for Bitcoin. In case of a serious problem with the U.S. dollar, I think is a wise move by any state. Texas has taken some steps in that direction. Utah has, and if we see a bunch of hiccups in the next few years, you might see other states following through. I mean, if there were a real problem with the U.S. dollar or with the U.S. banking system, is there a way that the people of Texas could continue to engage in commerce and trade with one another and exchange value? That's a question that governors ought to be pulling their head out of their you-know-what and addressing.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Anything else to plug before we get you out?
No, it's great talking to you. I hope to see you sometime this year.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Okay, Buck.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that chat with Jeff Deist. Go visit at Monetary Metals. Give it a look over there and see what you think. As for this show, follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. To support this show, we just had our monthly Patreon supporters Zoom meeting with my priest, Father Ignatius. Wonderful man, wonderful man. We just had that. Every month, we have a Zoom meeting. It's not broadcast anywhere. It's not published. It's all private. Just my supporters who sign up at patreon.com/counterflow for $5 or more per month. It's us and a special guest. And this time I allowed you got to ask an Orthodox priest anything you wanted. So more like that in the future. Let me think. Who should I get for next month? I'm always open for ideas. And we got a very good guest coming on next week. He's an Orthodox priest. He's been on the show before. There's a few hints for you. And until then, you guys have a good one.
You get split in half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.